Hey everybody, it's Samutari here, and just a quick disclaimer before we get into this Pokepasta reading called Decisions. This is my Pokepasta. This is one that I wrote myself, and the thing is that the only problem with this one is that this was my first version of Decisions, and I kind of want to write you with both, so you kind of get the gist of what it's about. But originally this Pokepasta was about an original Pokemon Red version, and I found a lot of flaws with my original writing. A lot of people commented on it, said that it didn't make sense, and said that it was really basically a shit pasta. And so taking those things into consideration, I later revamped it, redid it, whatever you want to say, and I created a new version. But this is the original version of Decisions, therefore that's why it's called Decisions version 1, and later I will write Decisions versions 2, and read that one for you as well. So feel free to leave me a comment, but even if you do, know that I've already fixed a lot of the mistakes from this actual pasta, so a lot of the things that you see that's wrong with it now will not be wrong with it in the later version that I read. But still, feel free to comment, let me know what you think of it, and etc. And yeah, so I guess enjoy one of my many Pokepastas. It's true that the hardest part about playing Pokemon was always the beginning of the game. Not really the choosing of the name of your character or the gender, but it was the option of choosing that first Pokemon that would shape the entirety of your adventure. Seems strange, doesn't it? I mean, when you think about it, your first Pokemon really does not shape the world in the game. It does not influence how the storyline will play out. You do not get some secret chain of events for choosing a Charmander rather than having a Squirtle. In fact, the only thing that really changes with the first choice is the Pokemon chosen by your rival, and then the way in which you need to fill the Pokedex. So why does this decision seem so profound? What has it that makes our hearts race in our chest, makes our palms sweaty, and makes us bite our lips as we weigh the options? What is it, past the team building, that makes this decision so hard? I remember that my first Pokemon game was a red version that I received for Christmas in 1998, with a brand new Game Boy Color. It was my pride and joy, but as all things, it had aged a lot, and by the time 2013 came around, every time I popped it in, I was forced to start a new game because the battery inside the cartridge was all worn and no longer saved. But because this was my first prized game, when I finally moved to Germany and started getting paid at my new job, well, needless to say, nostalgia hit me hard, and I decided to celebrate my recent success by sending my cartridge away to have it repaired and then sent back to me. It was a month-long process. The guy fixing my cartridge lived back in the USA. He had contacted me via email when I posted a status on Facebook, looking for someone to do it, and claimed to be a friend of my brother. He seemed like a really quiet guy, loved tinkering with old games. He said it was a hobby of his or something, and knowing that my brother was always a reliable source for things that needed fixing, I figured this guy was legit, paid him a little over $10, and then what it cost for shipping, and while the month of waiting was agonizing, when I received my cartridge back, it was all I could do but lock myself in my room, lock my bedroom door, close the blinds, turn off the lights, flip on my SP, and lose myself back in the simpler times, that simpler world of the classic generation of Pokemon. But not everything was the same. When the intro started, it was not the classic battle between Gengar and Nidorino. In fact, it was something completely different. It showed the three starting Pokemon in their final evolved forms, battling it out for supremacy. It was not the innocent little movements and fake clashing sounds either. Charizard's claws actually left gashes. Venusaur's whips were tied rather tightly around Blastoise's neck, and seemed to be squeezing the very life out of him. The sight disgusted me. I was outraged. What had this guy done to my game? Obviously, as someone who has been on the Pokepasta website for some time, I knew that hacking games for some was a rather simple process. Anyone could do it if they had the training and technology. And while I'd only paid him to replace my battery, it would seem that this guy had decided to take things up a notch and amp up my game with some custom detail. I was for sure he would think I'd be grateful, since these old games were so simple and some found them boring. But no, I was angry. But not wanting to wait another month to send it back so that he might return this game to its former glory, I decided to keep playing to see what other surprises he had made for me. The battle scene could only be stopped by pressing the start button, and then you were taken to the front screen where normally red would appear, and Pokemon would then start to cycle through. But it would seem that our little game guy had not only changed the opening battle scene, he had changed the front screen too. Obviously, it now showed Red holding a Pokeball on the left with a Charmander, Blue holding a Pokemon ball on the right with a Squirtle. And then in the background, there was a lonely Pokemon sitting in the corner with no trainer. A Bulbasaur, with his face shadowed over. That was my first indication that something about this storyline was going to go very badly for me. Because as I started my game, obviously male, named my character Red as my default, rival state as Blue, and entered Oak's lab after trying to go into the tall grass, that scene of the lonely Bulbasaur was still playing in my mind. What did happen to that third Pokemon that was never used? It's not like in Gold and Silver where the professor takes it and takes care of it. It's not like White and Black where all three are eventually chosen. This was in a time where there was meant to be a female character to make a third-party option, but all in all, the games went out of their way of their original design, and out of the way in the anime and comics by leaving that third Pokeball to sit on the table and rot. The thought really made me sad, really made me feel bad for the last Pokemon, and made me feel so horrible for that poor starter that would always get left behind in some version somewhere. Still, as soon as I was prompted to choose my Pokemon, I went for the default Charmander, and of course Blue then proceeded to choose his Squirtle. Professor Oak began his speech about going out, training your Pokemon, reaching for those high goals, and the normal stuff. Now as I turned to leave, Blue came up to me, and where normally he would have battled me, instead he said, "Charmander is the coolest. It's always the Pokemon Gramps runs out of first." I knew you would choose Charmander. I would have gotten it myself, but Gramps let you choose first. That's okay, though. Second best is always Squirtle, and I'll be able to beat you no problem once me and my partner start training. Smell you later. Then, without another word, or even a battle, he took off. This was odd. Now my sprite was joined by Professor Oak, who bowed his head and sighed, "Yes, Blue is right. Charmander is a very powerful Pokemon, and is very popular with boys your age. I have been doing this for several years now, 17 to be exact, and every year, it's always Charmander and Squirtle." He turned to Red and then said, "Won't you change your mind about what you have chosen?" That's when the classic talk bubble came up, and all Red said was ... "Yes, that's what I thought," the professor sighed. "You want to show my grandson you can beat him against the odds. I can't blame you. Leave now, and have fun on your adventure with your new friend." Then he walked away. It had not even given me the option, because now that I was thinking about it, I might have changed out partners just because I felt so guilty. But what had he said before? Almost 20 years of handing out Pokemon to children of Pallet Town, and not once was a Bulbasaur chosen? This thought was still running through my head as I exited the lab, and right as my sprite crossed over the threshold of the door, I thought I heard a mangled Bulbasaur cry. After that moment, the game continued as normal. Battles with a rival were normal, all the Pokemon were normal, even all the scripts were practically normal. I zoomed through the game, having beat it so many times before. I even got together the same team I always did, and not even bother catching any extra Pokemon. After beating the Elite Four, I was for sure that I was done playing, and would soon send this game back to the guy who hacked it so that he could fix it, and return my money for doing things without my permission. But when I entered Pallet Town, via Fly and my Hero, I was going to talk to Oak one last time, just to pretend I was saying goodbye, when at the lab door, someone crashed into me. It was Blue! "Red, you gotta stop him, he's gone crazy, And then Blue's line of text stopped. His sprite was very shaken, and looked worse for wear. His clothes were ripped, and he looked like he was in bad shape. Still, what was he talking about? Was something wrong with Professor Oak? I knew this had to be something that had been added in the game by that hacker. Knew that maybe he had inserted one last battle with Team Rocket, or some new enemy that I would have to fight in order to finish the game once and for all. I guess I could have just turned it off there, but human nature often lets curiosity get the better of us, and so I went into the lab. When I entered, there was a gruesome sight. Bookshelves were laying flat on the ground. One of them had crushed the body of an aide. Books were scattered all over with the pages, and the other aides were dead, except for the female, who cowered in a corner made by the falling bookshelves. Text bubbles continued to pop up among the screen that said, "Just die already," and "Gah!" before there was that sound again. The sad and mangled Bulbasaur's cry that had been heard when I had first left for my Pokemon adventure not even 30 hours ago. Finally approaching the professor's desk, I let out a cry of my own in the real world as I saw the new scene before me. It was dark, and there was Oak, kicking around the Bulbasaur that used to be in the last Pokeball. The one that was never chosen. His skin was peeling, eyes hollow, and dark blood stained the floor. The professor noticed me right away and said, "I knew you would come back, but I was hoping I could spare you from seeing this." And then he continued, 17 years ago you chose a Charmander as your partner. 13 years ago you chose a Charmander again. 9 years, 5 years, 2 years, and today. Today, you chose a Charmander to start off on your Pokemon journey. He then ran over and kicked the Bulbasaur again. It let out a low and mangled cry, and more blood spurted from its body. "This Pokemon!" he cried as he continued to beat the poor thing in front of me. I tried to stop him, but I found that I could not move. "This Pokemon has sat and rotted with age. It is hideous. It is a monster, and I must get rid of it like I have all the others." And when the question mark appeared above Red's head, the professor stopped his assault on the poor creature and said, "You're confused? For 17 years, this Pokeball has sat here untouched. No food, no exercise, nothing. Why have it anymore? You will leave again one day, and when you come back, it will be Charmander all over again. My grandson will choose his Squirtle, and I am tired of hearing this damned thing cry." And the assaults had started again. "I don't want to hear it anymore. Why have it? You will never choose it. It's time for this creature to die." Now I understand why Blue was so shook up. The professor was insane. Even his eyes had gotten a red tint to them. I had to do something. His kicks and punches had gotten faster, and now there was an HP bar above the Bulbasaur's head that was slowly diminishing, with each series of attacks by Oak. Finally, my sprite was able to move, and I ran to the Bulbasaur and clicked it. Its hollow eyes looked up at me in distress, and the option bar came up. "Put Bulbasaur into your party?" Then the classic yes-no option appeared. I do not think that I had pressed the A button so fast in all my life. I was crying on the other side of the screen. I had never even thought about choosing Bulbasaur because fire had always been my favorite. I mean, it was only supposed to be a game. Never in my life had I even had the notion that had this been a real world or an alternate universe, that a real Pokemon would be made to sit and rot like this. I clicked yes as my option, but that's when the bar said, "You have no room left in your party. Please deposit a Pokemon first." I cursed under my breath. I had totally forgotten about this. So I ran as fast as I could to Oak's PC, and luckily, I quickly deposited my Victory Bell out of my party. Luckily, it was the first one. Even still, while normal game functions should have ceased while I had accessed the PC, Oak's attacks had continued, and try as I might to move towards the Bulbasaur, right as I made it to the Pokemon sprite to press A, the HP bar reached 0, and the Bulbasaur gargled before a new text box said, "Bulbasaur has died." Professor Oak stood there in a large puddle of blood and said, "Good. It's done." I turned off the SP crying, and feeling defeated. It took me an hour before I was sane enough to remember that I had saved in another city. I could go back and try again. So, switching on my system once more, I ran to the PC first thing in Lavender Town. I wanted a ghost Pokemon, but was having a hard time catching one, and deposited Victory Bell. That's when I flew to Pallet Town to face the nightmares once more. The same scene played out. Blue burst out of the lab, scared out of his mind, the aides were dead. By now, I figured they had tried to stop Oak, and he had killed them. And after the rant, Professor Oak started attacking the mutilated Bulbasaur. I ran to it first thing, and accepted it into my party. Oak cried, "What are you doing? Stop!" But I did not stop there. Having played the game for many years, I always used the missing no cheat. So, opening my bag, I used a full restore on the poor Bulbasaur. His mutilated appearance remained, with the hollow eyes and missing skin, but his stats were back to normal. Next, I started unloading one rare candy after the other. The Bulbasaur soon became an Ivysaur, and then even a Venusaur. And I did not stop until my new Pokemon was level 100, completely maxed out with all the proteins I could feed him. He still looked somewhat gruesome, eyes were still missing, pieces were still missing, scratches, and he was still a little bloody. But to me, just being alive and on my team made this Pokemon the most beautiful creature in the world. After I was done, I turned to Oak and I spoke to him. The text was jumbly and shaky, but he screamed at me, "How dare you!" The Venusaur stood beside my sprite, healthy and roaring out in anger towards the professor. The Venusaur took one step and headbutted the professor into his desk, knocking him unconscious. And then, I knew what to expect. Just like with the 3 evolved Pokemon battling at the beginning of my game, Venusaur used Vine Whip and wrapped the vines around the professor's neck. The face of his sprite kept turning a deeper, and darker color, until at last the blood started to pour from his mouth. Venusaur let go, and the body of the professor fell to one side. A part of me knew that I should have been horrified by this, but I felt almost glad that the professor was dead. I had my own share of guilt for all the pain I'd put this poor creature through by never choosing it as my starting Pokemon. But what Oak had done was truly unforgivable. Even in a game, There was no excuse for harming a Pokemon for anything, especially for being unwanted. Now that the battle was over, the Venusaur turned to me and roared again. A text box appeared. Give a nickname to your new Venusaur? It may have seemed rather silly, but after all that had happened, I could only think to name him one thing. Buddy. After that little scene, I decided that I was going to send my game back to the guy who had hacked it, but not before I had traded Buddy to my gold version, then on to my ruby version, and onward through my different parties. Turns out Buddy was not a male, but was actually a female, and was actually shiny. She traveled with me in my main party everywhere, and overpowered everyone and everything. She was always first in my line, and only seconded in my starter when I was grinding for levels. I also started buying all versions of the generations, so that, from now on, I could choose all 3 Pokemon in one version or the other, and none of them ever got left behind. My game eventually came back to me a month after I had sent it back to the States. My old red version had been restored to its former glory, no glitches and all the old graphics, with a full refund and a note inside that said, "Glad you learned your lesson." It turns out the guy knew that it was what it was like to be alone. He was always chosen last in games, never had any friends. He admitted to having lied about knowing my brother, and while he originally had no intention of hacking my game, when he looked through the code and saw my record of picking Charmanders, it had really struck a painful nerve for him. When sending the game back to him, I had made a record of what had happened, how it made me feel, and told him to never do this to anyone else ever again. But in a sense, I'm thankful for it now. It may just be a game, for some, but Buddy has been one of the greatest Pokemon that I could have ever asked for. And what it all came down to was one simple decision.